Hey, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net. In part 1 of our bird flock tutorial, we created a bird that we'll be using as a part of a flock. So, let's just jump right back into it. Okay, take our bird composition that we made last time and drop it onto the Create New Composition button, which will create a new composition the same size and length as our bird composition. First thing I want to do is make the composition bigger. Choose Composition, Composition Settings, and then set it to 1000 by 1000 pixels. I'm also going to change the name of the composition to Bird Flock. Hit OK to confirm. Good. Now I've got a little more room to play with. Next, with the bird layer selected in the timeline, hit S to reveal the scale property for the bird layer. And then let's scale the bird layer down to about 20%. OK. Next, let's click on the 3D layer switch to make the bird layer a 3D layer, and turn on its collapse transformation switch to fully bring its 3D attributes into this composition. If you aren't clear on why we just did that, see my earlier tutorial on working with Z-Scale in After Effects, which explains it in more detail. But the short of it is that turning on collapse transformations preserves all sorts of properties from layers in a nested composition. In this case, the 3D aspects of the layers in our nested bird comp. The 3D wing and the body. But despite all of this, it doesn't have 3D coordinates. On the other hand, activating its 3D switch allows it to use a 3D coordinate system, but doesn't actually bring the 3D attributes into the composition. So on their own, neither makes the nested composition fully three-dimensional. However, the combination of collapse transformations and the 3D layer switch working together make the nested composition a full functioning 3D layer. Okay, I want this bird to sort of float around the comp window a bit, so I'm going to add a wiggle expression to its position property. This will create a small amount of random motion for some added realism. With the bird layer selected, hit P to reveal the position property. As before, Alt-click on the stopwatch to create a new expression, and then add the expression you're seeing here on your screen. This expression means 1 time per second, wiggle the layer up to 30 pixels off its current location on every axis. So our first number is a rate of wiggle, and our second number is the amount of wiggle. Oh, for accurate viewing purposes, I don't want to forget to turn on the motion blur for the composition. As you can see, we can't turn it on for the layer because we've collapsed our transformations, which means that since we have the pre-comp layers with their motion blur already turned on, After Effects will render any motion to those layers as motion blurred. By collapsing transformations, we're telling After Effects to use the blur settings from the original composition, so we can't control it from here. By turning on the composition's motion blur, we're actually just telling After Effects to show us the blur. Unless we tell After Effects not to in our render settings, all motion blurred layers will be blurred when rendering, but we won't see that in a RAM preview until the composition's motion blur switch is turned on. Okay, a quick RAM preview and we can see that our bird is floating around a little bit with its blur turned on. Now, let's make several copies of our bird by selecting the bird layer and hitting Ctrl D. Then I'll position it a little bit away from our original bird. You know what? I'm also going to move it away slightly in Z space. Okay, and now I'm just going to do the same thing over and over again, creating many copies and positioning them. I'm going to flash forward in time a few moments where I have my birds set up. If you'll notice, I've also scaled a few of them up or down a few percentage points to make them look a little different. However, a real problem that's going to make these look awfully fake is that all of their wings are moving in perfect synchronization. We want some randomness, so what I'm going to do is start moving each layer backwards in time to slightly different points, so that they each start on a different wing position. As I do this, let me point out that this is the reason I padded the time for my bird composition in part 1 of this tutorial. If the bird layer was the exact length as my final shot, as I slid these down in time, I'd run out of bird footage at the end. The birds would just pop out of existence before the animation was done. By padding the time, I end up with a lot of time to play with at the end if I need it. Again, I'm going to flash forward in time to where this is already set up. All of my layers are for the most part starting at different points in time. A quick RAM preview and I can see that my birds are all doing their own thing and floating around. Here I am back in After Effects with a composition of an image of a forest that's moving across the screen. This is a pretty lifeless video, but now let's drop our bird composition on top of it and work some magic. Okay, well, first things first. These birds are way too big. Let's shrink down the bird's flock. With the bird flock layer selected, hit S to reveal the scale property, and then scale it down to about, 12%. Looks pretty good. Also, let's make the birds a 3D layer and collapse the transformations as we've done before. Notice, by the way, that I've already turned on the motion blur for this composition, but in your composition, whatever you're working in, you probably haven't, so remember to take care of that. Now let's animate our flock flying across the screen over about 5 seconds. Making sure I'm on frame 0 of the timeline, I'll move the bird flock up to here on the mid to upper right side of the screen. Okay, and then I'll hit P to reveal the position property, and in the timeline, I'll set a keyframe by clicking on the position property stopwatch. Then, I'll move down in time to about the 5-second mark, and then I'll drag the birds across the screen past the other side, which creates a new position keyframe. A quick RAM preview, and so far so good, but we're not done. I feel like the birds aren't quite part of the shot, and I think that that's because the black color is a bit sharp. So I'm going to tint them a dark color that's not quite black, but that more correctly matches my background. With the birds selected, choose Effect, Color Correction, Tint. For tint settings, you can handle this in 2 ways. Using the Effect eyedropper, you can try and sample a dark spot from the shot, and that usually does it. But in this case, I actually want to inject a little bit of atmospheric blue in there. So I'll click on the Color Picker button, and in the Color Picker, I'll give myself a dark gray blue that's got its RGB values more or less in the 40s. Barely blue, mostly gray. Click OK, and it's not a huge difference, but it's definitely there. Also, I want to add a little bit of blur to the birds, just to make them a little out of focus. So with the bird flock selected, I'll choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Gaussian Blur. And in the Effect panel, I'll set the blurriness property to a value of 1. Okay, this definitely looks better to me. But you know what? I want some more birds in there. So I'll select my bird flock layer and hit Ctrl D to duplicate it. Now I just need to offset the animation and the position a bit. With the new flock layer selected, hit P to reveal the position keyframes for the layer if they aren't already showing. And then select both position keyframes by clicking on the word position. Now, making sure that you're either on the first or last keyframe in the timeline, in my case frame 0, drag the birds slightly in front of the original flock. And you know what, maybe a little bit down as well. I'm also going to move them back in Z space a bunch, maybe 100 units or more. There are no exacts here. It's really a visual thing that you'll have to experiment with. You try a few different things and eventually you find out what works best. Anyway, that looks pretty good, so I'm going to move on. Now let's offset the new flock's animation in time as well by dragging the layer a few frames back in time, similar to what we did with the bird layers in our pre-composition. This will also make the birds move forward in the composition window, which is okay. Finally, let's select the last keyframe and drag it past the 5-second mark a bit. The result we're going for is to have the new flock of birds flying slightly slower than the original flock, and to allow the original flock layer to overtake and eventually pass the new flock layer. Anyway, a quick RAM preview and we can see a fairly realistic flock of birds. Oh, I've also added in the ever popular overused lens flare effect here, but I think in this venue it's acceptable. And you know, this trick works in many situations. For example, throw it into a city shot, which I've done many times before, and you can also get away with it. In fact, the first time that I did this was for a motion graphics spot for Super Bowl Sunday, and we only had a still shot of a football stadium to work with. You know, like I said, lots of situations where you can use it. Anyway, it's just another trick that I use, and it will hopefully come in handy for you. Don't forget that you can get the files for this and other podcasts at www.creativecow.net/AE podcast. Once again, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net.